Hello there, it's me, Chase. I wanted to give some comments, some thoughts on the interview between Joe Rogan and Matt Walsh when they were talking about marriage and homosexuality. That's the point where the interview got really interesting. It was respectful, even though there was a strong disagreement between the two of them. I wanted to comment on this because. One, I thought Joe Rogan repeatedly missed Matt Walsh's points. And two, Matt Walsh didn't do a great job in the interview overall, in my opinion. I have a respect for Matt Walsh in many different aspects, but he also has a lot of issues. We all do, but there's a lot of problems with his theology, and his and that's really where it stems from, is his theology and his worldview, which is, I would say, a rather subpar biblical worldview. But of course, I'm talking as a Protestant, more or less Reformed Christian. I wanted to just sort of talk a little bit about the issues there. Joe Rogan's arguments were very much based upon I think this is a good thing to talk about, because that interview, and I think was really what was brought out, whichever side you come down upon in that interview, what was brought out was the difference between Joe Rogan's liberalism and Matt Walsh in conservatism. And there's going to be a point, right now we're trying to make nice because of the wokeness. And again, this is really illustrated in that conversation between the two of them. Because when they talk about the woke stuff and the transgender stuff, you see the two of them just like one-upping each other and like, oh yeah, absolutely, man, it's insane, it's crazy, it's just everybody's gone crazy, they've lost their minds, can't tell what a woman is anymore, blah, 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 blah. They're both in full agreement on that. When it came to the subject of marriage and what marriage is, that's where they disagreed. And I think it's really easy for us to miss the reason why they disagreed, and yet agreed on all these other things. The reason why is simply because theology matters. Your theology is key, and your worldview is key in this. And what that interview illustrates is that while our liberal friends, as in our not leftists, but our liberal friends, our sort of libertine friends of as it were, like Joe Rogan, while we have in common with them many things like not being insane, there is still irreconcilable differences that we can't ignore and pretend like we can just brush these aside. Especially if we're going to be Christians and consistent Christians, we have to recognize that Joe Rogan does not share our worldview by any stretch of the imagination. He has a radically different worldview than us. And I don't say radically as in he's insane. Again, he's not insane. I'm just saying these are irreconcilable worldviews. And one worldview is going to prevail, either Joe Rogan's or the Christians. And, Rogan may say, I'm not talking about worldviews. You cannot avoid it. You can pretend like you do, but you can't. Everybody's got a worldview. Everything that Joe Rogan said in his disagreement with Matt Walsh is all dependent upon his presuppositions and his worldview. He has a particular view of the world that causes him to disagree with Matt Walsh in the marriage issue. And that same exact worldview allows him to agree with Matt Walsh when it comes to the transgender madness and all that stuff. The woke stuff. So it's a good interview to talk about, because it does contrast the irreconcilable differences between a very classical liberal perspective and a Christian conservative perspective. And that at some point, even if we were to defeat wokeness, which I believe we will, post-mill, but even if we were to defeat wokeness, at some point that's going to have to be confronted. That irreconcilable difference. One of these worldviews will win out in the end. Either the Christian worldview or the Joe Rogan's sort of his libertine worldview kind of thing. But Rogan, on to that point, Rogan's argument, again, based on his perspective, is that what's wrong with gay people, getting married, what's wrong with gay marriage? Because, again, in his worldview, God doesn't play any part in his worldview. And so Joe Rogan doesn't start with God's commandments because he doesn't believe they have any relevance to society. He would say that it could have relevance to you personally because it gives you personal meaning, but as a rule of society, he would reject that entirely. Matt Walsh, and this is the problem where Matt Walsh is frankly weak, because Walsh, I don't understand, and I tweeted about this. When I tweeted Doug Wilson's response to that interview, and I thought it was a great response. Doug Wilson did a great job. I wish it was Doug Wilson instead of Matt Walsh. But in my tweet, I said that it boggles my mind. Because Matt Walsh, I saw him on Twitter justifying the way his interview with Joe Rogan. I don't see how he thought he did a good job in the interview. I've never seen Matt Walsh so uncomfortable. You could hear it in his voice. There was shakiness. He was really uncomfortable because Rogan was just pounding the point home, and Walsh struggled, especially when they got to talking about the problems with gay marriage. Matt Walsh really struggled. I mean, it was painful to listen to. Sorry, it was, but I don't understand. Matt Walsh he was justifying his performance in the interview against people, probably presuppositional people like myself, saying Joe Rogan doesn't have a worldview. You're not really going to win anybody. All you're doing if you just talk about the Bible is you're just pandering to your own audience, and you're not trying to reach Joe Rogan. You have to sort of come down to his level, sort of thing like that. I get what he's saying, but the thing is, the reason why Matt Walsh didn't do very well is because Rogan, we as this idea that Matt Walsh is propounding is honestly kind of silly, because you're trying to do convey your worldview without talking about your worldview, which is kind of deceiving somebody, and trying to sort of not bait and switch, but you're just not being forthcoming and honest, and especially when it comes to the subjects like what they were talking about, the gay marriage thing. That is a fundamental Christian issue, and you try to pretend like it's not. How do you expect to win Joe Rogan over to your side? That's one thing. But the other thing is who do you think you're fooling, Matt? Who do you think you're fooling? With pretending like let's not talk about Christianity. Joe Rogan knows you're a Christian. He knows you're a Roman Catholic. So I don't get why you're trying. You continue to try to hide it and just try not to talk about it. You might as well just go, hey, I'm a Christian, and this is what the Christian faith believes. And I remember now that's where Matt Walsh really struggles, because Joe Rogan was like saying, why would God create gay people? Why would he do that? And just sitting there listening to Matt Walsh completely just face plants in his attempts to answer the question. It's a good question, but he just has nothing. Honestly, he just doesn't have any response, any legit response, because he just simply will not say, what I would say is just, God doesn't create gay people. He doesn't create people gay. He doesn't create people sinful. He creates people, and this is where you can start talking about, he creates them in Adam, so they are created and they're born with a sin nature because they are in Adam. Then you can start explaining federal headship from the biblical perspective, things like that. But see, he doesn't want to do that because he's like, well, he doesn't believe in that stuff. And this this reflects the apologetic differences. Guys like Matt Walsh, they have a view of free will that I disagree with. That Joe Rogan has the power to make a choice for Christ. I would say that he doesn't. That Joe Rogan, according to Scripture, is suppressing the truth. And what you have to do is you have to expose that suppression. You have to expose them. We're trying to talk people into the faith. And we start with trying to pretend like we're not really Christians. We're just sort of just people like you. And you're just sort of trying to it's like what you end up doing is you're just sort of like trying to goad them into the faith. And Joe Rogan's not an idiot. He's going to be like, he's sitting there, and it's like he's begging Matt Walsh, let's talk about your views of God. Let's talk theology. Like, why would God do this? He's inviting you into a theological discussion. And I'm like, just go for it, man. Just do it. This is why for Matt Walsh, this is why people like myself accuse you of being embarrassed of the Bible. Because that's what it seems like. It just seems like you just don't want to go there, and you just keep making the excuse, well, he doesn't believe any of that stuff. I don't know, man. He was inviting you into a theological discussion, and you just wouldn't go there. You wouldn't do it. And you would rather sit there, kind of look like a bit of a goof, fumbling with your words. And I think a couple times you see him look up into the ceiling. That's him struggling to really find something, just looking for scraps. Anywhere but, one of these, Bible. Because the simple fact is, Joe Rogan, he did, for all the things that I disagree with Joe Rogan on, particularly theology, he went to the source, the actual right source. Why would God do this? You've gotten into a theological discussion. He has brought the discussion to a theological discussion. And Matt Walsh, Joe Rogan was, the agnostic Joe Rogan was more willing to go into a theological discussion than Matt Walsh, the Roman Catholic, Trinitarian guy, Bible-believing dude, wanted more than he wanted to. And I think that's saying something. I think that's problematic. For me, I want to get somebody right into the scriptures and start asking questions about the scriptures. And then if Joe Rogan wanted to go, well, what about the Bible and all of its mistranslations, all the translation issues? Then you can get into that. I was talking to a Roman Catholic a little while ago. I was asking her, she kept accusing me of reading my own theology into the Bible, and that I needed to stop doing that and just earnestly pray to God, like, praying the rosary and stuff like that, which is funny because, and I was telling her this, interesting, because Mormons tell me to do the same thing. Mormons tell me to do that. They do it, and they arrive at totally different conclusions than you do. So it's got to be more than just pray your heart out to God, because we can't really trust our hearts. Our hearts are deceitfully wicked, as the Bible tells us. But I asked her, I said, so can you demonstrate to me how as a Protestant, how I'm misunderstanding and misreading the Bible? Can you show it to me? And what I was doing with that question is I'm inviting her to go into the scripture. It's kind of like, the Charles Oliveira, UFC fighter, former champion, lost pretty badly to Islam Makhachev, which I was a little disappointed in his performance. I like Oliveira, but one of Oliveira's tactics, the way he wins and the way he tried to win, and it backfired on him completely against Makhachev. What Oliveira does especially when he's in trouble, is he will go to the ground. He'll deliberately go to the ground, and most fighters, the fighter instinct goes, oh, he's on the ground now. That's my chance to just finish this and ground and pound, blah 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 blah. And they'll try to do that stuff. And so what Charles Oliveira does is when he gets hurt, he'll go to the ground. He's inviting you into the ground, because that's where Charles Oliveira thrives, is in the wrestling, is in the jiu-jitsu, is in that is his world, that's his home. Except when he was fighting Islam Makhachev was like Bane and Batman. You think wrestling will help you. You merely adopted wrestling. I was born with it, kind of thing like that. That's kind of what ended up happening. It totally backfired on him. But that's what Charles Oliveira typically does. Is he wants you to come. You want to take me out? I'm wide open. Take me out. And then he gets you. Then that's where he gets you. That's where he's most comfortable. And that's kind of where what I was doing. I was like, you want to talk? You want to tell me that my understanding of scripture? I was and I think what I was demonstrating was my confidence in my views according to scripture. I'm like, you want to, and I do that again in all my apologetics. Whenever I'm talking to Mormons, I'm like, I want to let's get into the scriptures. Let's get into the Bible. Let's do it. Let's go. Let's get right into it. I love being there. That's where I'm most comfortable, because I know the Bible fairly well. And so when I'm talking to anybody, like if I were talking to Joe Rogan, I would do the same thing. Let's talk about the Bible. And then when Joe Rogan tries to do things like what he's done before, is like, well, how do you know the Bible's true? How can we trust it? We can start talking about its reliability. It's a tested history. We can start quoting Bart Ehrman, who's famously known for Bart Ehrman, who's a skeptic, but he's also famously known for saying that the New Testament is the most widely attested document of ancient history, kind of stuff like that. We can start talking about that, all that stuff. I'd be happy to go into all the historicity of the Bible and everything, and how it absolutely stands the test of time, unlike anything in antiquity, anything in history, by a wide margin. We can start going about that stuff. See, I don't got any problem doing that. I would love to do it. You want to talk about the Bible, Joe Rogan? Joe, let's do it. Let's talk about the Bible. Let me get my Bible. Let's get out here and open it up and let's do it. And I would love to explain all this stuff to you. And I think I wasn't going to talk about all this, but we're sitting here, we're wondering why apostasy is running rampant, and it seems like the Christian faith is diminishing. Have you ever considered that maybe one of the reasons why is because we simply don't trust God to move? And I say, oh yeah, we do. That's why we're doing all this. But my point is you have to get God's word to people. And if you do what Matt Walsh did, which he didn't at all, ever, with Joe Rogan, not once, not even, just like I said, we just wouldn't even go there, then you've accomplished almost nothing. I can guarantee you, Joe Rogan did not walk away from that interview with talking about the issues of homosexuality and marriage and how the Christian worldview explains this stuff. I don't think he walked away from that impressed at all. And I was thinking about this the other day. Why should God move in this country? We keep asking God to move. We keep saying, "Oh, we gotta get God back into this, into this." And without God, this is all going to be for naught. But why should God move? And He could. I'm not saying He couldn't. I'm not saying He needs us, but He does use His people to do what He's going to do. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. God can work in any ways He wants, but nevertheless, why should He move in this country if His people, if the church, doesn't trust Him and His word to do it? And so we try to find different ways to convince the Joe Rogans of the world to come to our side. And then what we end up doing is we end up kind of looking a little foolish, a little silly. And I say this as somebody who respects Matt Walsh a lot. I have a lot of respect for Matt Walsh, but he has serious issues with his theology. Real try to make this quick, but again, so you look at the contrast and differences between Matt Walsh and Joe Rogan and their worldviews, and the worldviews of the people who are watching and listening to this. It's either going to be a Christian or it's going to be this Joe Rogan sort of very autonomous perspective. One thing that I wish Matt Walsh did, other than what I was just talking about, is he could have turned the tables on Joe Rogan. Because he could have been like, well, Joe, you and I were both talking here quite a bit about the wokeness and all the insanity going on with that you can just decide whenever you want if you're a boy or a girl or if you're an animal or something like that, blah, 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 blah. and how silly and insane that is. Why is it insane? It's insane because it's not actual reality. It's subjective. And so if Joe, if you're going to agree with me, you agree with me that if what we are is just subject to whatever our preferences are, then what we are is nothing. Ultimately, in the long run, it's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything because its truth is dependent upon the individual's sort of mental perspective. So it's ultimately meaningless. And so, Joe, you would agree with me on that, but yet here you are saying marriage is just a subjective thing. And so don't you think that therefore as it is with the transgender issue, it's therefore ultimately not really a thing. It's just sort of this imaginative thing that we've come up with. And then Joe, you kind of hold to the theory of evolution, that we've evolved to be what we are. Then a couple things. Doesn't it appear that therefore our purpose, if we have any purpose, which we don't really, if it's just evolution, wouldn't you say that if our purpose therefore is to just procreate, is that the only goal for the species is to survive, and procreating is how we survive, by continuously producing offspring that will continuously get its genes into the next generation, and on and on and on, that kind of stuff like that. Don't you think that? And then so therefore it seems to me that on a consistent evolutionary worldview, homosexuality would be detrimental to that, and therefore should be, because you cannot produce offspring with a homosexual relationship. It seems very clear to me, and I'm going to get a little graphic here, but just for the sake of argument, you're warned. It seems to me that the vagina and the penis are meant to come together to produce offspring. The penis and the anus don't do that, and in fact will actually typically lead to infection and disease and death. So it's very obvious that the rectum is not meant for, and Joe Rogan has used the words designed for the human body numerous times, so it's fascinating he does that. I don't think he even recognized he did that. Wonder why though. It just kind of comes out of your mouth because it's kind of just it's the truth. We are designed. It's pretty obvious, but we suppress the truth. So that ruins one thing, all that stuff. But that seems very, very obvious. And for two lesbian women to even have to pleasure each other, they have to use fake, toys that simulate a penis to do what they're going to do. So it seems pretty clear that that's abnormal, to say the very least. But particularly on an evolutionary worldview perspective, it's very clear that even if we're just talking evolution, that evolution did not intend, which is funny to say and ironic, did not intend for us to function in this way. It seems pretty obvious. And so on an evolutionary perspective, homosexuality is detrimental to the survival of the species. It contradicts evolutionary theory. And I know Joe Rogan has said, well, he said to Matt, there's been animals that have even shown homosexual behavior. Okay, sure, I'll agree with that, but what does that prove? I mean, doesn't that mean that species is dysfunctional as a species because that those animals, whatever, because their job is to procreate and to just breed and get their genes into the next generation. So those aren't going to last very long, are they? So it's the same issue. But even more than this, Joe, if it's true that we are just the products of protoplasm having mutated into complexity, which is already strange in and of itself. Mutations typically dying thing, like it destroys, doesn't actually create more complex organisms. But anyways, point aside, Joe, don't you, the we all we are is just a product of this evolutionary slime that came out of the waters and from an asteroid or a whatever, all this stuff, and that we just eventually evolved and mutated into these complex things that we call human beings today. But therefore, it seems to me, again, going back to the idea that evolution's goal and purpose is the survival of the species. So that would mean that our job is to procreate, and so then wouldn't marriage itself simply be not, it wouldn't be compatible with an evolutionary worldview, the whole concept of marriage, because the idea is that you are binding yourself to one particular human being. Wouldn't it be more advantageous to get rid of marriage and that males would just like cats do, just male cats just walk around impregnating other cats just left and right? That's just what they do pretty much all day. Here in San Antonio, we have a cat infestation because cats aren't getting fixed, and that's just all they do. Wouldn't that? It seems like that would be a little bit more advantageous. Marriage seems like it might make that a little bit more difficult, because you only have one woman who should be just constantly getting pregnant. Again, if we're to assume an evolutionary worldview. Now, obviously, I think Joe Rogan would find that just kind of silly and nonsense. But Joe, again, that's the logical outworking of an evolutionary worldview, because that's all you are. You're an animal. You've said it numerous times. We are just a strange animalistic species, but we never behave like it. And when we do, when human beings actually behave like animals, we see that as a drawback, as wrong, and like, grow up or something like that, and that's much animalistic behaviors lead to death and violence, and we go, that's wrong, we need to stop that. But they're animals, Joe. Aren't they just acting on their base instincts? So you could take this in there's so many ways that Matt Walsh could have turned the tables on Joe Rogan and go and put him on the spotlight. Can we talk about your worldview, Joe, and see how your worldview adds up to all the stuff that we know of and we see today? How does your worldview explain this? How does your worldview explain that? How does your worldview explain you're an advocate of homosexuality? How does your worldview explain homosexuality when homosexuality in an evolutionary worldview completely contradicts its fundamental principle of survival of the fittest, survival of the species? You cannot survive in a homosexual relationship. So how do you explain these things, Joe? How do you explain these things? But he wouldn't do it. He just wouldn't go there. Just just to sum it all up, here's what Matt Walsh did. Okay, so Matt Walsh allowed himself to be on the defensive, and then he did not defend his own perspective. He just tried. I mean, he A for effort, I guess, for trying to just find some way to impress Joe Rogan other than using his own worldview perspective. So you have this worldview, Matt, you have this belief, and yet when it came down to chow time, as it were, I guess, when the rubber meets the road, you did everything you possibly could to avoid talking about that worldview, and that's the big problem here. So you could have done that, but so now I've picked on Matt Walsh the rest of this whole time, and that's it's probably not fair, but just to say that I did like what Matt Walsh said. What he was trying to say is that marriage is an institution, and Joe Rogan continuously missed the point, and he kind of contradicts himself, I think, when he talks about transgenderism is wrong, and because it's it gets into when you trying to make it to where these guys can pretend to be women and then just go beat up other women, that's wrong. Yes, obviously we agree with that, but I would say it's inconsistent for Joe Rogan, because he's saying there that your subjective feelings about what you are irrelevant to the objective reality, and yet when it comes to marriage, it's the total opposite. He's totally changed on that. But the other thing too is that Joe Rogan missed, that Matt Walsh was trying to point out to him, is that marriage is an institution. It is the bedrock of a functional, stable society. with the marriage between a man and a woman, which is designed by God. And you see it in the very first human beings in the scripture. Again, and again, if Joe Rogan wanted to talk about, well, what about, we can get into the historicity of the Bible. I again, wouldn't be afraid to do that. We'll just, let's do it. But it's very obvious to somebody who's not suppressing the truth and unrighteousness that marriage is designed for a man and a woman who have the two parts that we mentioned earlier that are clearly designed for each other. It's very clear, very obvious, and that not only is this designed to bring these two together in an intimate way, but it's also designed to bring forth offspring. And so their union brings forth love between the two of them, and it brings forth life. Now, Joe Rogan said, well, what about those who can't have it? That's beside the point. And Matt Walsh did a good job of answering that by rebutting that, basically saying, the fact that there are couples who can't do that, can't procreate, doesn't change what it's meant to be. It's like saying, and Doug Wilson said this kind of well. He's talking about, he compared it to Joe Rogan talking about dysfunctional kidneys. It's like saying, well, somebody has, bad kidney problems, therefore, all kidneys are, therefore the reality of kidneys is what? Nothing but subjective or something. Like, just because you have one outlier here doesn't change the objective reality. It's irrelevant. It doesn't mean anything. So it's just kind of a silly point that Joe Rogan was making. But but what Joe Rogan didn't realize, what he fails to realize, because he's kind of given over to this libertine worldview perspective, and he's so given over to it. I think it's idolatry, that he doesn't recognize that it is this ideology that he has, this worldview. It's a worldview, Joe, but this worldview that he has, he doesn't realize that it is that very same worldview that has led to what Doug Wilson said, the clown world we're living in right now. If it is true that we are nothing more than protoplasm and that we've evolved into what we are today, we have no ultimate judge who we must answer for, who created us in his image and who designed us to function in a specific way. If that is not true, then we have no ultimate purpose in life. Purpose is subjective, as Joe Rogan would say. And so therefore, I can just make up my own purpose. I can make up what I am. I can make up who I am. I can make up what marriage is. I can, all that stuff. Marriage is not the bedrock of society. Marriage is whatever I want it to be. I want to marry a cat. I want to marry my dog. I want to marry my brother. I want to marry my sister. I want to, all this. You can do whatever you want with it because it's all subjective. Joe, you admitted it. You said it was. It's all subjective. And so you can do all that. And so that's what Matt Walsh's point was, is that if you allow marriage to be just this purely subjective, it can be whatever you want. And when it's whatever you want, it's not actually real. If, again, going back to the what is a woman thing, so we can identify with each other here. Matt Walsh's his documentary, which I've watched, he goes around and he's asking people constantly, what is a woman? And that's literally the title of the documentary. That's what he's doing. He's going around the country asking people. He goes to women's marches. He talks to professors, these crazy, nutty people. What is a woman? And they can't answer because they don't have a functioning definition of what a woman is. They would constantly say, well, a woman is whatever you say it is. And so Joe, if a woman is whatever you say it is, again, the question, so then what is it? It's nothing. It's the same thing with marriage, Joe. If it is whatever you want it to be, ultimately it's nothing. It's the same problem with communism. If everybody owns everything, nobody owns anything. It's the same thing. That's the problem, Joe. That's what you missed. And what you missed from there is that if we give up what marriage is, the union between a man and a woman, if we give that up, we have opened the floodgates to all the other stuff that we have here that we're dealing with. Joe, all the stuff that you say is nonsense, is causing people to go insane. But Joe, your worldview has what's allowed that in. That's what it is. And that's the problem. That's why marriage has to be between a man and a woman. That's why we as a society, if we are going to function as a society, must have marriage. And don't give me this whole, well, a lot of marriages fail. That again, irrelevant. That is totally irrelevant. That does not change the reality of what marriage actually is. This is the same silliness as when people say, well, I don't want to be a Christian because I've met so many Christians who are terrible. So what you're saying is people who do a terrible job of following the Bible is the reason why you're not going to follow the Bible. That doesn't change. That does not change what the Bible is and what it says. What that is that all that demonstrates is that there are a bunch of people who are a bunch of hypocrites. That's all that demonstrates. It doesn't demonstrate that the Bible is not true. That's all just fluff, so you don't have to actually deal with the issue of who and what you are. A sinner in the hands of an angry, righteous God. You don't have to deal with your sinfulness. You don't have to deal with it. You can just pretend it all away and do the Romans 1 thing. That's what it is. So that's the point that was being made by Matt Walsh. What it does for society. If you want a functioning society, God has designed it in a way that this is how it's supposed to be. If you want a functioning society, but we don't want to do that. We want to do our own thing, as Joe Rogan says. We just want to be happy. Well, what's wrong? We just want to be happy and doing what you want to do. The problem with that is, what is happiness? What is it, Joe? What is happiness? It's whatever you want. Well, then it's ultimately nothing and meaningless. And so, I'm pretty sure a lot of the serial killers of the past were pretty happy doing what they were doing. Kim Jong-un is pretty happy being a god among those people over there in North Korea. We can go on and on and on and on, So what is happiness? What is it then? See, again, if you have no objective truth, in other words, God, anchoring your worldview, then it's in free fall, and who knows where it's going to land, and who cares? What's the difference? What does it mean? What point is there? We're just biological protoplasm, and all we are is just Jeff Durbin likes to say it's a lot. When you watch if in an evolutionary worldview, what is rape but just stardust colliding with other stardust? What is it? And I know that's offensive. That's so rude and mean, but that's your worldview in a nutshell. And you go, no, it's not, but it is. How is it not? How is it not? Show me how it's not. Give me the objective anchor, the central element of your worldview that helps you explain that rape would be wrong. I can tell you why in the Christian worldview, because God is that center, that anchor, because God made women precious in his image and are to be treated kindly because they are made in his image. We are to treat all our neighbors as made in the image of God. God told us to do this. And he's put it in our hearts that these creatures have value. You do not possess value on the virtue of your own mental fizzing. Value cannot come from your own mind, because if it comes from your own mind, then you can remove value. I can remove the value of my neighbor. I can just in the same way that I give value to things, I can also take away values. But on the other hand, if we decide and we recognize that value is outside of us and given to us by another source, then again, it's like the Bible. How do you know? How can we come to truth? By properly exegeting Scripture, because Scripture is the one thing that we have that is theopneustos. Nothing else is theopneustos. Now, even Roman Catholics will say that, at least not all the ones I've talked to, we don't have anything else as theopneustos. And they'll talk about tradition, and they'll say it's not
theopneustos, but they'll act like it is. That's one of the problems with our Roman Catholic friends like Matt Walsh. But everybody confesses that everybody in the Christendom world will confess that the Scripture is the only thing we have theopneustos. Okay, well then, wouldn't you say that therefore, if we want to get to truth about who God is and what He said, we should probably get into the Scriptures, not to our theological biases that are going to color what we see and what we think, because then we'll never get to truth. Because then truth really ultimately is what I say it is. Well, truth is what you say it is. Truth is what he says and she says. And then you do that. So what is truth then? It's nothing. There is no truth. And so that's why you get into the world that we're living in right now. Radical skepticism. Nobody knows how to understand anything. Nobody knows the truth about anything because we have abandoned truth. The truth. The same truth that defines left and right, that defines 2 + 2, the same truth that defines man and woman, the same truth that defines marriage. And Joe Rogan's worldview has permeated that. That's why his worldview fails. Imagine if Matt Walsh did that. Oh my goodness, imagine if he did that. Now I think that if you did something like that, Joe Rogan may walk away from that interview maybe flustered, a little bit irritated, probably. And I think that's one of the problems here. Matt Walsh was there looking to make a friend. Hey, I got an offer to go on Joe Rogan's program. Well, that's very kind of him, and I want to return the favor by being kind to him. And then, Joe Rogan does that to you, and you still want to try and be buddies. I'm not trying to say that you don't want to be buddies, not saying that, but it seemed to me that Matt Walsh was more concerned with impressing Joe Rogan than he was standing up for truth. And he ultimately, ironically, I don't think impressed Joe Rogan at all. But imagine if you decided to go in there and you did that, you might have got him upset, and you may never get invited on the program again. But I tell you what, man, the chances of him never forgetting that interview go up pretty substantially. You might do something to him that you might plant, where a buddy of mine says, you might put a pebble in his shoe that he just cannot get out, that he's got to deal with, that he may try to ignore for years, but ultimately would have to come to terms with. Imagine if 10 years from now, Joe Rogan, after that, maybe if it took 10 years, and then Joe Rogan suddenly went, I think I'm a believer, and I have to give it to that one guy, whoever that might be. Let's say Matt Walsh. I had to give it to him. I just could not stop thinking about what he said to me, and how he just, at the time I was so angry with him, because he was just, it felt like he was mocking my worldview and he was insulting me and everything like that. But when I look back now, man, he was loving me. He was showing me love by telling me you're in a delusion and trying to get you out of it. I'm trying to wake you up to it. Wake up, Joe. This is false. This is all false. And if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't. I haven't had this happen yet, but I know of many stories of former Latter-day Saints who came to the faith because there was a faithful Christian standing on the corner at General Conference who was there to talk to them, who ruined their day. Just all I want to do is go to General Conference. These Christians are here just bugging me. But man, how many stories can we tell of former Latter-day Saints saying, I'm so glad that guy was there and he ruined my day. Because ruining my day ruined the delusion, and it led me on a path to the truth. And imagine doing that to Joe Rogan. The opportunity that Matt Walsh had, and he floundered it. Because, his whole, we got to try and get down to their level and impress them. Again, I don't see how Rogan was impressed at all with that interview, with his answers, anything like that. Because at the end of the day, it was just being a people pleaser to Joe. Sorry, that's what it was. At the end of the day, it was just Matt Walsh was just trying to please Joe Rogan. Even after Joe Rogan starts to really go at him, still wants to be friends and nice. You'd think you go, all right, Joe, you wanted to go there. Okay, let's go there. Let's do it. And then again, you don't have to be a jerk about it. You don't have to be rude about it. Just say, well, Joe, here's explain to me, Joe. I really would like to know how. You could start by explaining your world, the Christian perspective, and say, well, in the Christian worldview, God created. The Bible says that God created them male and female. He made woman for man and man, for woman, and that their union, that they were to be married. That marriage is an institution designed by God. That they're to come together and to procreate and to continue the species. And under the bedrock of marriage, under that institution, would raise stable families, and therefore children who grow up to be stable human beings, to then continue the cycle and create a just and good society. Ultimately, that was the point, Joe. And obviously it's not going to go that smooth, but that's basically what you would explain. And then you can start. Then after that, after you explain all that, you can start going. So Joe, all right. So I think I've explained myself fairly well here, and I think it's only fair that if I have to spend a lot of time in the cross-examination, I think it's only fair that we kind of put you in the box. Is it okay, Joe? Can we just, I'd like to see how you would explain a lot of these things. Okay, so Joe, let's talk about your worldview perspective, in which you have a very evolutionary idea, concept going, that we're just sort of we've evolved biologically to what we are today. And yet, but at the same time, you believe in homosexuality. You think it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not hurting anybody. I would disagree with that, but you would say it's not. So how do you explain a homosexuality, given that homosexuality doesn't procreate, and yet in the evolutionary worldview, the whole idea is the survival of the species, and that requires procreation, and therefore homosexual relationships would be detrimental and should be outlawed on that basis. How would you explain that, Joe? So that's what you could do, and then start putting the spotlight on him, and let him feel the heat from that spotlight, and start going, okay, how do because there are massive holes in his world, but nobody wants to, because he's Joe Rogan, right? Because he's the host. You're not supposed to do that to the host, right? And that's just unfortunate. But so those are some of my thoughts on the Joe Rogan interview with Matt Walsh. So I hope this is helpful and useful to you guys. Soli Deo Gloria. God bless. Bye.